Hey guys, Peter here to tell you about the latest from Witchskull, the Serpent Tide, out June 16th on Rise Above Records. This album has 8 songs, 35 minutes in length, and this is the band's 4 full-length studio album. They are an Australian stoner metal band. The design of this record is simple. It's linear, straightforward, very compact, very balanced. It's a very thick-sounding album, and there's not a lot of movement up and down throughout this record. There is some movement, but it's more lateral movement in terms of contracting and expanding songs. But when you look at this design and you look at 35 minutes, you see why. It's the perfect length for a record that has this kind of experience. If the album goes a little bit longer, it starts to become redundant, starts to become repetitive. Keeping the album short and compact, considering the overall sound, is the perfect solution for an album that comes across this way. Very thick, very laborious. You really have to work through it, but that's just the style and sound of the band. So you just have to work with what you got in order to create the best experience possible if you decide to listen to the record from first all the way to the last song. As far as the overall sound experience, this is a thick sounding album, and I was expecting perhaps the thickness to be a little bit more textured, and it's not. It's a little bit more guitars in the forefront with the bass helping that thick sound, that thick experience, and those guitars to become really prevalent as far as what's driving this album and what's driving each and every single song. The drums fall a little bit more behind it, and I felt more often than not the drums help expand the footprint of the tracks. A lot of that contracting and expanding sound really comes from the drums in terms of how they touch that guitar sound and then how they move away from it. The vocals are more consistent in the forefront, sometimes moving a little bit deeper, but always finding a way of breaking through. This is the overall dynamic. Now, if you have an album that has this overall dynamic or this overall fingerprint, you have to create some nuances within the sound for things to become a little bit more vibrant, for the sound to feel a little bit more alive, for a lack of a better term. And I felt like they did this on this record with a few different subtle movements. The first one that I noticed was coming from the drums and the impact that the drums had to that thick sound of guitars and bass. There are certain songs where the drums move from the back to touch that sound in order to give it even more thickness, even to give it more substance, but also allowing themselves to move back a little bit further so that you can see the distance between the two and you can see that sense of expanding and contracting that I've been talking about. That comes really from the connection between the overall drum sound and what's happening in the forefront with bass and guitars working together. The other nuance that I found on this album musically was in terms of what the bass is doing with the guitars. More often than not, you're going to find both of them working together in order to create that thick sound experience. But there are a few tracks where they allow the guitars to drop out or drop down and moving the bass into the forefront, allowing it to be the driver of the song, or at least in pockets of songs. This is an interesting element because it still gives you that sense of thickness. The sound doesn't really change that much. It's just coming more from one element versus the other, but enough to give ebbs and flows, or very slight ebbs and flows, making songs more interesting, keeping somewhat of the same formula, just changing the ingredients that are going into it. Interesting element that really impacts in a positive way the overall sound experience. And then last but not least, on the sound and in terms of the variety or the slight variety that exists, that is coming from the guitars. The guitars are pretty much consistent in terms of that thick experience and being in the forefront, being the guides that take you from first song all the way to the last song. But there are moments where you see the guitars being a little bit more penetrating, a little bit more driven, a little bit more clear, thinner, if you will, but moving backwards behind that overall thick guitar sound that exists in the forefront. This creates a duality of worlds. It creates a breeze that kind of pushes this wall of smoke and fog into the forefront. This is really interesting because it allows you to feel like there is a current, an underlying current underneath that calm sea, that thick, calm sea. So when you have these 3 different elements changing within songs from song to song, but keeping the same formula or the same recipe together from start to end, you have enough there to allow variety to come in, but not to be necessarily noticed. It goes almost unnoticed because you're just so taken back by the overall experience, by that thick sound, by that robust sound, that all of these small nuances are impacting you in a positive way because you're not feeling like you've heard the song before, but they're also going underneath the surface to a point where you don't necessarily pay attention to them unless you dive much deeper into what's driving the sound and what's giving the unique DNA and unique fingerprint to each and every single song. And let me say this, I love the guitar sound all around on this record. I love the bass sound. The bass sound is phenomenal. I like the tonality of the bass. I like how much it hits. I like how much it pops. I like how it works so well together with the guitars, and it works so well together in terms of creating that uniform representation of what this album is all about. But I also enjoyed when it comes in almost alone, and it represents almost a secondary guitar in terms of how much riffing there is to it and how much thickness there is to that riffing. So the bass really outstanding throughout this record from start to end, and the same could be said for the guitars, because at first glance the guitars are going to feel very uniform, very compact, but there is a lot of life underneath it. You see it in the solos, you see it in those more penetrating, more slimmer sounds that really cut through some of this haze, and that is a way of creating more energy within the songs, is a way of creating a little bit more of a diverse approach so that the guitars don't have just one single outcome on every single track. And I really enjoy that, while not changing the dynamics too much, while not changing the DNA too much. It's just enough for you to experience something else and for you to feel like the songs have perhaps a little bit more texture, even though I don't feel like this is a very well textured record. It's not. It's very raw. It's very bare bones. It's pretty much how you see it is what you get. But having those little intricate elements guitar-wise is just the right spices in the right recipe and the right food in order for things to just come across slightly different. Vocally, this is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all record, but it's also not a super dynamic album. You have a more calm, collected delivery, and then you have a more emotionally driven that expands, that really stretches out the sound when you start to hitting some higher notes, and you see the vocals really pushing the song along, really allowing you to have more of a forefront impact and that emotion coming through in that delivery. I felt like the nuances between the two, or the movement that exists on song by song between the two, was really interesting. It infused some needed life in some of these songs that otherwise it felt like you were sinking in quicksand. So it was a nice element to have, and it was a nice element to have on an album that otherwise feels too compact and too cohesive. So having the vocals vary a little bit, or at least have two polar edges that allow the movement to exist vocally, it's one more way of adding some overall excitement to an album that just feels so heavy on the listener's shoulders. It really brings you down. It's a draining sounding album by nature. So having these little sparks of energy here and there really wake you up in the overall experience of going through this album. An album that has great sound, great experience. It is rough enough, but it's not overly rough. It's produced, but not overly produced. It's a record that at the end of the day sounds big, feels big. It has a warmth to it, and it's just rough enough in order for you to get that stoner experience to come across in its sound and in the vocal delivery. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I have to start off with the 3 opening tracks. I love these 3 songs. It sets the tone for the rest of the album. Starting off with Tyrian Dawn. This is the opening song. Great guitar and bass together, really working well together as one. The drums are slightly behind. Sometimes they push forward and they touch each other, but then they also move backwards, and you can see the distance between the two. The vocals consistently in the forefront, using more of those penetrating riffs in the background, infusing some energy, infusing some light into a very dark, somber, not ominous, but just very dark and somber song all around. Enough to make some dynamic elements be created almost organically within the track, but it's a song that really lives off of that guitar sound, a killer bass sound, a song that has a lot of shape, and that shape in part is created by how the bass connects with the drums and with the guitars. Next you have Obsidian Eyes. I love the drum sound on this track, and I have to say that drum sound really starts to build up right from the get-go. The song starts with it, and then you can see some fuzziness coming in, and you can see a fuzzy experience develop, and the song starts to gain momentum and gain pieces and grow and pushing itself forward. The guitars start to become a little bit thicker, infusing movement at the same time as they create volume. Vocally, you see some boundaries being pushed. You see that more controlled approach, and you also see that more stretched out, breaking through style delivery. It's a song that has moments where it feels super contained, and then it has moments where it feels completely off the rails. That is kind of the dynamic or the duality that this song has. Not necessarily moving up and down, but it definitely moving side to side. Great delivery, great sound, great killer bass, and outstanding drums throughout this entire track. Last but definitely not least, my favorite song on the entire record, Son Carver. The stomping sound experience is really the DNA or the fingerprint of this track. You really feel like you're stomping, but you're not necessarily stomping, you're walking through mud. So you're raising your feet really high, you're not walking that far, but then you're putting them down really heavily into the muck. It feels that way. The killer riff that this song has, or that it comes in and stretches out, has that same movement to it. It gives you that same sort of experience. The vocals have the ability to give you something different in this song. I felt like the vocals on this song were a lot more emotionally driven. They felt more connected with the message, they felt more connected with the lyrics, and they definitely felt more connected with the overall sound experience that they created, that stomping, that moving slowly but fiercely at the same time. That is the overall style of the track until it gets to the middle point. In the middle point, the song really goes off the rails. It becomes super driven, faster, heavier, rougher, more rugged, a little bit almost like losing control. A song that starts to disintegrate almost in front of you. That's how it feels sound-wise and even vocally to a certain extent. And then it has this super dirty soloid feedback that just ties into that whole idea of losing control and start falling apart, almost like a plane that starts to go beyond its limits of speed and starts to lose elements, loses a wing, loses a second wing, loses the cockpit. The song kind of has that dynamic to it. It just feels like an out of control train. And everything in it becomes out of control. The vocal delivery, like I said, the solo. But then when it starts to reach the tail end of the song, you see things slowing down and you see the regaining of the shape. And you see the song kind of coming back to the way it started. So it goes full circle. That moment there from the midway point almost all the way to the end of the song is extremely important to break away from any other dynamic and to break away from any other model or plan or print that the other songs have. This song becomes very unique because of this experience, because of this controlled experience in the first half and completely out of control experience in the second half. It's pretty much a Jekyll and Hyde song, but you start off as Hyde, and then you go Jackal, and then you finish off as Mr. Hyde. So there's that ability of losing control of yourself, but regaining control and regaining your shape as the song finishes off. Great track, feels super emotional, feels very emotionally connected, very emotionally driven. And when you connect the sound, the experience, the vocal delivery, everything together, becomes one of the most complete tracks on this album. This is it, Witchskull with the Serpent Tide, out June 16 on Rise Above Records. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.